I'm Luis Montoya. I am DART's Chief Planning Officer, and also have Rick Pallister on the I guess call, Zoom, whatever we call it, with us as well. Going to talk tonight about some long-range planning that we are doing here at DART. I have about 20 or 30 minutes of content that I'm going to share. It's going to be broken up in a couple different sections, so we'll definitely have some time for conversation. But really, this is designed as a two-way venue, hopefully. So really just encourage you to unmute yourself, ask questions in the chat, and then we will have a couple of times in which we pause and are able to just have a more in-depth discussion. There's a link here on the page to ridedart.com/plan. If you haven't already, really encouraging you to take a survey to help us understand the needs for DART in depth. Also encourage you to share and encourage others to take our survey, as it's open for a couple more weeks. Many of us have probably become accustomed to these Zoom meetings, but just a couple of quick pointers as we get underway. As Rick mentioned, you all started as muted. Feel free to unmute yourself. There's an image there to show you where the mute button should be. Same thing about video. If you wish to turn your video on, I welcome seeing your face. Yeah, like I said, feel free to interrupt or ask questions in the chat. Any other pointers we want to lay out before we get underway, Rick?
No, that sounds great. I'll be watching the chat, so if anyone has any questions or needs anything, just let me know.
Great. So, I'm scrolling through folks who are on the line, and I know I've met many of you or been in conversation, and so you're probably familiar with DART, but I'll just spend a quick second reviewing that. DART as Central Iowa's transit provider really focus on a couple of service types. Our main service type is what we call fixed route bus service, and those are the buses that operate on a set schedule at a set time, and really are the backbone of our service, carrying the highest number of our customers. We also have a rideshare program, which is a van pool service, which focuses on serving long distance commuters. It actually has service. It has vans that go among 18 counties in Central Iowa, so a much larger footprint for that rideshare service. And then we have paratransit service, which is a door-to-door service that serves people with disabilities who are unable to ride our fixed route service. On the right are just some statistics about the main reasons that people use DART. By far and away, getting to work is the number one reason that people use DART. So we consider ourselves a key piece of the economy here in our region, but also getting to medical appointments, shopping, education are all key reasons why people ride DART. This is a map showing the 12 member communities of DART. As I mentioned, we have that rideshare service that does have vans that go across 18 counties, but really most of our service is in Polk County and extending a bit into Dallas County, serving these 12 member communities. The lines on the map are showing our bus routes, and then the purple zones are our on-demand routes, and then the blue square in Urbandale is our Flex Connect route. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these further on in the meeting, but this is really just to give a geographic sense of the area that DART primarily serves and where most of our customers are. Tonight, we have focused this meeting mainly on Des Moines and some adjacent areas of unincorporated Polk County. We are having a handful of these public meetings where we're able to dig a little bit deeper into some of the opportunities and challenges of public transit in different parts of DART's service area. And tonight is the night where we'll mostly be talking about Des Moines and unincorporated Polk County. But of course, comments and questions about all of our service area are welcome, because we know that it is a regional transit system and people don't just travel within Des Moines. We've done surveys in the past and we get customer requests on a fairly regular basis. And this list here is just some highlights of our most requested items. We understand that people, just like anybody, people who utilize transit want to get where they need to go. They want to get there quickly. They want to get there comfortably. And so a lot of the requests we get are about, shorter travel times, more frequency, operating at times of the day that we don't currently operate. And so all of this is not to say that we already know it all, but really that just to recognize that we have received feedback in the past. And so tonight, as I'm requesting additional feedback, it's really to hopefully reaffirm some of the goals and some of the challenges and opportunities that I'll share, but also to hopefully get more refined feedback about exactly where people are trying to go, exactly when, so that we can try to tailor services to meet the needs. I mentioned we've been receiving feedback over the years, and of course we've been implementing changes over the years. This is somewhat of an abbreviated list of some of the things that we've done over the past about 2 or 3 years to try to be responsive to that feedback that we've received. There's been things that have focused on some of our busiest routes, like in 2018, we were able to start service earlier in the morning and add more midday service to those busiest routes, but also where we've added new service or extended existing bus routes to reach additional destinations. A lot of that has been done by finding efficiencies in our scheduling and to be able to provide that service, or pursuing grants or having partnerships with in some cases, employers to extend routes to meet those job sites. A couple of notes here that affect Des Moines, since we're talking specifically about Des Moines, is the Euclid Douglas Crosstown route. That's Route 50 that was created in 2018 to be responsive to feedback that we received that people don't always want to have to come into downtown. If they're traveling east and west, they don't always want to have to come into downtown Des Moines to transfer in order to head back out and get east to west. And so that was an opportunity that we saw, and things that we'd probably like to emulate moving forward. Also point out the service to Deer Ridge, which is a multifamily housing community that is geographically kind of separate, and that has a longstanding need for transit that we were able to finally meet with a route that goes there 5 days a week in Route 11 extension there in 2019. And then lastly, I'll just point out that we have been able to double the number of bus shelters in the area as a whole. Many of those are concentrated in Des Moines, but not all of them. In addition to those service enhancements, we've been focusing on improvements to our vehicle fleet and some of our customer-facing technologies. I have a picture there in the upper left of the electric buses that we are piloting. There's 7 electric buses currently in service, and the goal there is to not only be able to have a smaller environmental footprint, zero emissions, but also to study whether an electric fleet can have lower life cycle costs than a diesel fleet. We've also been investing in slightly smaller buses, recognizing that not all routes are the same, and we don't have to have quite as big of vehicles on all our routes. And so on some of our lower ridership routes, we have now vehicles that are about 10 feet shorter than our normal 40-foot bus. And so that saves us a little bit on the upfront costs and a little bit on the fuel efficiency, and all of that adds up to just being more efficient overall. And then on the bottom, a couple of notes is that we've upgraded all our fare boxes on board so that people have more options for how to pay, including mobile payment. We have a mobile app that allows people to plan their trip, to pay for their trip, and to see when their bus is arriving. When we think about the future and planning for the future, there's a couple of key challenges that we recognize. And the first is that our region is growing. By some estimates, we could be reaching up to 1 million people over the next 20 years. That growth is happening all throughout the region. We have seen a fair amount of growth in Des Moines and see more of it to come. That's been very encouraging because especially when we have growth near bus stops that already exist, those are the easiest customers to serve. But we also know that our region is growing outwardly. And so a challenge for DART is to consider whether and how to serve housing, and jobs that aren't located near existing bus routes. Also, like any public entity, DART has limited funding. Our primary funding source is local property taxes. While we do receive a fair amount of federal revenue as well as state revenue, our primary funding source is local property tax. And so we want to always try to be responsible with the public funding that we receive, but we also want to think about how we can diversify that so that we can try to meet the growing needs of the region. In addition to those kind of regional challenges, the transportation sector as a whole is evolving. Whether it's the move toward more active transportation like walking and biking, or towards the availability of more shared options, things like car share, ride share, bike share, scooter share, all these things that are enabled by mobile technology, by the gig economy, the shared economy, and in some cases electrification, electric cars, electric scooters, electric bikes. All of these are promising trends in the sense that they provide more opportunity for diversification so that we can potentially cater options to people's needs. But of course, they're not without their challenges, as we'll discuss a little later on. And so what we want to think about, though, is what are the role for some of these new options in public transportation? How can we enhance access to public transportation or just, overall improve how people get where they need to go? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about this long-range planning study that we are embarking on. The goal first and foremost is to optimize the existing service, to do the most with the resources and the service that we already have. That could involve small changes here or there to be responsive to public feedback and some of the analysis that I'll share, or they could be larger changes. We also want to look at those evolving transportation needs in the region and the innovative services that we have to offer, to think about how can we match our services with the needs and develop a long-range plan. This is an overview of the timeline for the project. Tonight, I'm going to share some of the existing conditions analysis that we've put together so far, but really, I really want to get public feedback. And so we're going to have some pauses where we discuss what I share, and I'll talk a little bit about a survey that we're conducting. All that public input and analysis will be put together so that we draft some recommendations over the summer that we come back and share towards the early fall, and then collect input on those draft recommendations so that we can develop a final plan by the end of the calendar year. I'm going to go over some existing conditions, but this will be a good opportunity for us to engage a little bit more, for me to take some questions and comments from you. The first thing I'll note before we jump into existing conditions is the existing service is really that DART tailors the types of services that we provide to demand and to underlying needs. So not all bus routes are the same. Some routes operate 7 days a week. Those are routes that are really serving our busy corridors with dense housing and lots of destinations. So we're really putting our most resources where they're most utilized. We also recognize that there's lots of places in the region that maybe don't fit that category of density, but still have an underlying transit need. And so for those types of places, we might have bus routes that only operate on certain days of the week or only at certain times of the day. Another category of bus route that we have are express routes that really focus on long distance commuters. So they could be serving like park and rides where people drive and park and get on the bus to travel the longer distance. These routes are really focused on bringing, they've been historically designed to bring residents of outerlying communities into downtown Des Moines. And we'll talk a little bit about how those needs are evolving. And then lastly are what we call on-call zones. This is more of a door-to-door transportation service. They tend to be fairly limited they're really designed for short trips. And we tend to offer them just during limited days of the week and limited times of the day to help people to run their errands, but they don't tend to be set up to be necessarily commuter focused. They're not operating in a time of day and days of the week that people can rely on to get to work, but are more limited than that. This is a map of ridership for our fixed route bus network. On the next slide, I'm going to zoom in more on Des Moines specifically, but wanted to give just an overall snapshot of ridership. This is, you'll note, 2019 ridership. We chose to look pre-pandemic. We recognize that there have been impacts to ridership during the pandemic, and possibly even though we're recovering now, looking forward, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But really, if we think about transit use and ridership is really a function of the underlying land use, population demographics and the service. And those things aren't necessarily as, we fully expect those things to stay the same as we look forward. So that's worth studying. A few things that I will draw your attention to are that all the bus routes do have some ridership on them. Those ridership patterns may look very different. If you look in much of Des Moines, you see lots of blue dots all around the routes, some dots smaller than others, but there's lots of dots. That really indicates that we have a system where a lot of people are walking to the bus stop, versus if you look further out, the further out you get, the more distance you see between those blue dots. It's not that we don't necessarily have bus stops, and in some cases the bus stops are spaced further apart. But really it has to do with really nodes of activity. And sometimes those nodes of activity are shopping centers, sometimes they're park and rides, sometimes they're job sites. But it's less density of service, but it's also less density of use. And so, as I said before, we tailor our routes to meet those needs. So those are also routes that don't have as much frequency or operate as much throughout the day. So this is really what I want to spend some time talking about tonight, is our existing service in Des Moines. We have the most service that we provide out of any of our member communities is in Des Moines, and that's with good reason. That's where a lot of our ridership is. And so we really try to meet the needs with the resources that we have. However, we are fully aware that there are lots of unmet needs. And that's really, one of the key reasons that we're doing this study. We've done studies in the past. For those of you who are familiar with the DART Forward plan, it's something that we do on a somewhat regular basis because those needs evolve. And so we understand that there's needs in the community that are still there, but we also think that there's probably new needs that are arising, especially as we think about that growth or just how the economy is evolving, and especially after COVID-19, how people's travel patterns are evolving. And so we know that there's a lot of especially like if you look on the south side, there's more north-south routes than there is east-west access. We get comments about how all the routes, really most of the routes, come in and out of downtown Des Moines. But if you're just trying to go across town, like say from the east side to the southeast side, that can be challenging. These are things that we've heard and that we want to build on, and that we're really trying to get more fine-tuned feedback about. I'm going to talk about just a couple more trends, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions and comments. So in addition to looking at ridership data, we have looked at land use data, both existing today and projected growth. We've looked at travel behavior outside of just transit travel behavior, but just general travel behavior, people driving, people doing whatever. Whether you're aware or not, you're tracked on your cell phone through the apps that you use, and that information can then be sold. It's anonymized, but we were able to purchase such a data set and really look at how people are traveling. And some of the things we noticed is that, a lot of the regional travel patterns do not mimic the existing transit network. The transit network has historically been designed to bring people in and out of downtown Des Moines, because that's historically where the majority of the jobs were. However, that is evolving as our region grows, as more jobs are located throughout the region. The transit network isn't designed to necessarily today to meet those needs. And so that's a key thing that we want to think about is how do we evolve the transit network? How do we mix in additional options in that network so that people can get to work? especially those low-wage jobs. When we think about how, especially service sector jobs, one of the comments that we get a lot is that people may be able to get a job, especially a service sector job, out in the suburbs, I'll say West Des Moines, but then where they live, there's not a bus that goes there on Saturday when their shift is, or that is there when they get off at 1 in the morning or something, or when they need to, so we understand that, and that is a type of travel pattern and a challenge that we want to try to come up with solutions for. I mentioned COVID-19 and the impact on ridership. At the peak of the pandemic, ridership was down by about half. That it was not equal. Some routes were down more than others. Some days of the week were down more than others. And so those patterns were, I think, a little bit revealing to us. The one thing that we saw was that despite businesses being closed, despite urgings for people to stay home, to practice social distancing, that people still rode Dart. And that really told us that a lot of our ridership are those essential workers that we all rely on to get our food, to care for our loved ones. And so they were still riding Dart. Weekend ridership in particular, where we saw 70% of normal weekend ridership, even at the peak of the pandemic, told us that the people who ride on the weekends really rely on it to get their essential services, to get to their jobs. Local routes, those routes operating most frequently, did see the least impact. Also, those routes that serve higher density neighborhoods, more destinations, saw less impact than those long distance commute routes, because of course, many white collar workers were able to work remotely. And so that trend in particular is one that we want to keep in mind as we think about the future and closely watch how some of that travel pattern returns, or how it evolves, and how we might want to evolve our services accordingly. Okay, so I want to pause there. That was just a pretty brief overview of some of the existing conditions, but really the purpose of this meeting, in addition to just sharing that, was really to hear from you all about the challenges and opportunities that you see. Are there things that I said that resonate with you? Are there things that maybe I didn't get quite right, or that you can really help build on to provide more nuanced feedback about the needs in our community? I really appreciate you unmuting and chatting, or putting it in the written chat. So just a quick primer on transit planning. Try to, I guess, put it simply. The goal of transit planning is to get you where you need to go, to get you there quickly. Really, this is about just thinking, when we boil down what it is that we're trying to achieve with this planning process, is really hopefully this simple: get you where you need to go, get you there quickly, comfortably, safely. The way we determine that is through a number of factors. I've mentioned, I've shared with you some of the data. I've mentioned the public input that we're doing, really trying to drive that public survey and public meetings such as this. We also have working with a number of human service partners to magnify our message, in particular with some hard to reach minority and low income populations that we know don't participate in public meetings, let alone virtual settings like this as regularly. And so we're doing our best to try to meet folks where they are. And that's some of the ingredients, I guess, to get to that transit service. And here's just a list of some of those things that we're looking at. But when we think about what that service could be, I think that's where we see a lot of potential, and that's where, as I mentioned, the industry is evolving, and we have some opportunities to think creatively in order to meet those evolving needs. We know that that buses on set schedules and set routes are going to continue to be the workhorse of the DART system. There's no more efficient way to move people than to put most people you can on the same vehicle, one driver, one vehicle, the most people, and that's a proven formula for busy corridors, dense housing, lots of destinations. As you get to situations though where you don't have those factors, where things are more spread out, where not everything's walkable, then that's where we see the bus being less efficient. And so as we think about that, then we want to, that's where we think that we can introduce additional modes to try to meet the needs. Things like Uber or Lyft, where the trip is really done on demand, right? It takes the person where they need to go, when they need to get there, as opposed to on a fixed schedule. Those same types of technology can be applied to transit vehicles, to a vehicle that has a professional DART driver, that has a wheelchair lift, that is set up to carry multiple people, right? More efficiently combining more people on one vehicle, kind of that middle ground between a full bus and a ride share. Also thinking about how we can integrate better with Des Moines' existing bike share system. I understand that the bike share system, did pretty well during the pandemic as more people sought to get outside and sought active transportation and recreation, and that they're expanding with additional electric bikes, which I think is really promising. And so I think we're definitely following that closely and thinking about how, what is the intersection between bike share and transit? How can that be enhanced? So when we think about our existing bus system, we think about, how can we build on what we already have? Are there route improvements, such as more frequency, that we know could help get people where they need to go sooner, make the system more reliable? Also serving additional areas. We've talked a little bit about some of those areas that either don't have transit or don't have transit all days of the week or throughout the day, where we'd like to get that feedback. We'd like to find ways to try to serve those needs. Additionally, improving the condition of the bus stops, making them accessible, having a safe place to wait with some shelter, but also integrating multiple modes so that people have choices. Co-locating things like bike share, or like park and ride parking, or car share even. I don't think our region currently has car share, but that could be something that is promising for us and allows people that flexibility to choose the right form of transportation that makes sense for them for that trip. And that's something that's been successful in other communities. And then as we think more about some of those emerging mobility solutions, those innovative service models, there could be a role, we think, for replacing bus routes with low ridership. I mentioned at the top that we currently have a partnership with Uber and Yellow Cab. There's a section of Urbandale, and actually it touches on a bit of Des Moines near Merle Hay Mall, where we actually replaced a bus route, used to be called Route 73. We replaced it with a zone by which people can use Uber or Yellow Cab to get to a bus stop. Now that made a lot of sense because there were really only a handful of people who were relying on that bus route on a daily basis. And it turns out that it did make, it was a cost savings for us to transition people over to using Uber or Yellow Cab to get to the bus stop. They were still ultimately DART customers and getting on DART routes, but it was just how do they get to those routes? So it was one less transit transfer, and instead it was a transfer from Uber or Yellow Cab. And so that's also what we call first mile and last mile solutions. How do we get people to bus stops, especially where they're not living close to that bus stop, or the environment is not conducive to walking. The locations are further spread out. So we can enhance access to transit potentially by using some of these more flexible modes and services. And then also, again, those unmet areas, in particular where some of those needs are spread out, where they're not, all on one corridor that can be efficiently served by traditional bus service, where they're more spread out, or where they're needed at different times of the day. And so whenever we have sort of lower volumes of need and needs that are spread out, it could be that a more flexible on-demand approach is the better fit. So in closing, just a reminder of what the process is. We have some existing conditions that we've been studying. I shared a little bit about that tonight. Really focusing on public input right now for the rest of the month. So for 2 more weeks, we'll have our survey open. I'm having conversations like this, and we'll take that input and combine it with our existing conditions study to develop recommendations that will come back out in the late summer or fall, and then with the goal of having a additional input before we develop a final plan by the end of the calendar year. If you haven't already, just last plug for the survey on our website. And right now we've received a fair number, but we're really trying to get those numbers up so that we can hear from a diversity of riders and members of the public and get a good idea of the needs.